So it's CPCTC. Okay, so no. So CPCTC is corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So with these proofs, what we're going to do is prove our triangles congruent, so we can prove that those sides in both triangles are congruent, or those angles in both triangles are congruent. Okay? So first, prove the triangles congruent, and then the sides are the angles. So looking at our first problem here, we're given segment WO is congruent to segment ZO. Okay, so I'm going to mark that on my picture. I'm also given that segment XO is congruent to segment YO. Again, marking that on my picture. Okay, so I need to prove angle W is congruent to angle Z. Okay, so first what I want to do is prove these two triangles are congruent to each other, because then their corresponding parts, or those angles, would be congruent. So starting with my given, I'd already marked my picture with that. Next, what I want to do is look for my freebies. Okay, I do have a freebie in this picture. I have vertical angles. So since I do have a freebie, I need to write that as a statement. So I can say angle WOX, making sure O is that center letter, because that would be the vertex of that angle, is congruent to angle ZOY. Okay, and I do need to label all three letters there. Now I can say those are congruent by the vertical angle theorem. Okay, you're with me so far?
Yes.
So now I do have enough information to prove these two triangles congruent, yes? Okay, so I can prove two triangles congruent. Now, remember when we're labeling triangles, they have to go in that same order. So for my first one on the left here, if I start at WOX, it's congruent to, I'd have to start at Z and then go to O and go to Y. So why are those two triangles congruent? By what?
Side angle.
Side angle, side. Okay, those two triangles are congruent by side angle, side. You don't use CPCTC by proving triangles congruent. Okay, the only ways to prove triangles are congruent are by our sides and our angles, like we did yesterday. Now, since those two triangles are congruent, I can say any of these corresponding parts within those triangles are congruent. So say I wanted to prove WX was congruent to ZY. I could do that now because those two triangles are congruent. So I can do that same thing with angle W and angle Z. Okay, so since those corresponding triangles are congruent, so are their parts. And that would be by CPCTC. Corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent.
What? There's no A or T.
I explained this in section 4.4. You know that, right? I explained what corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent are in 4.4.
I don't remember.
And I underlined each and every letter and then wrote CPCTC after it as an easy part to remember it. Okay, questions on our first proof here? All right, number 2. So in number 2, we're supposed to have 6 statements and 6 reasons. So those got cut off. So there's supposed to be 6. Okay. So first, looking at my given in number 2, I have segment AD is parallel to segment ME. Okay, so I use my arrows to show that. I also have segment MD is parallel to segment BE. So again, I can add my arrows here. To show they're parallel. I'm also given M is the midpoint of AB. So if M is this midpoint, what do I know about that segment or those? Both of those would have to be congruent to each other. Okay, since M is that midpoint, so I'm going to label that. Now, what I have to prove, I have to prove that MD is congruent to BE. Okay, so these 2 segments are congruent. So again, to do that, I can prove these 2 triangles are congruent, and then their corresponding parts are. So, using my given information.
Are we have to make like 1 statement on the test?
Eventually.
Not this one.
I'll give you how many there are. Does that help you?
What is our first quiz?
Your test
Next week Thursday.
is next week Thursday.
I thought it was Friday.
Next week Thursday.
Why not
Change the date now?
No, I never said it was Friday.
Shut up.
You know what time?
So, if I have parallel lines, what am I going to look for given parallel lines? If I am given parallel lines, what should I look for?
Oh, the AI, the like.
Your angles. You need to find angles. So you need to look for either alternate interior, corresponding, or alternate exterior because you want them to be congruent. So starting with my first set of parallel lines here, AD and ME. If I have a transversal right here, okay, my parallel line and my transversal hit this angle by A, right? This parallel line and this transversal hit this angle right here. Okay, so those are congruent. What type of angle pair is that? They're corresponding. So I can write angle A, since there's no other angle attached to that one, is congruent to angle EMB.
What?
Okay. Since angle A, there's only one angle there. So I can just use its letter. By M, there are 3 different angles created by M with its vertex. So I have to use my 3 letters to label which angle I'm talking about. Okay? If you just always use 3 letters because you don't want to mess it up, you can do that. So you could have said DAM, okay, as your angle. Thank you. I really don't need the comments anymore. So since these lines are parallel, we use if parallel. Then our corresponding angles are congruent. Okay, I still have one more set of parallel lines. That's DM is parallel to EB. And again, I'm going to use this bottom line as my transversal. So this first parallel line with my transversal here, it's this angle. And then my second parallel line with this transversal here, it's that angle. Again, these are corresponding angles. So I can write angle B is congruent to angle DMA. Again, I had to use those 3 letters to label that one. Since I used lines are parallel, we say if parallel, then these are corresponding angles, will be congruent. I do have one more piece of my given that I haven't stated in my proof yet. Okay, and that is that M is the midpoint of AB. Now I labeled it on my picture, but whatever I label in my picture, I have to write as a statement. Okay, so that means we can write out AM is congruent to MB. Why can I write that statement? That is the midpoint theorem. So now I can prove my triangles are congruent. So I have triangle ADM is congruent to, again, make sure you go in the right order for that second one. Since I started with A here, I have to start with M here. So this is triangle MEB. Looking at my 2 triangles, I have a side between 2 angles. So this one would be angle, side, angle. Okay, then my last statement has to be what I'm trying to prove. So now I can say MD is congruent to BE. Since my triangles are congruent, so are their corresponding parts. So we have CPCTC. Questions on number 2? Okay, I want you guys to do 3. So you're using this because you're proving triangles congruent. So you have to label the 2 triangles that are congruent.
One given. Remember, we're one given. Oh, one of them is a
Yeah.
reflex copy.
You are at one.
Oh, oh. On
Can we
number
try the other
one,
two, or are they different?
I think the very last one is different.
Alright. Yeah, just a combo try.
Yeah, okay. What's always your last statement? No. What's always your last statement?
I have to.
All right, most people are finishing up or done. So number 3, we have segment PQ is congruent to segment PS, and segment QR is congruent to segment SR. Okay, so that's our given information. Now I can't use either of those two pieces to prove any triangles congruent or any angles congruent. So what I want to do is look at my picture, and most people got this. In your picture, you have a shared side for those two triangles. Okay, since I labeled that, I do need to write it as a statement. So PR would be congruent to PR, and that would be the reflexive property. Okay, so now since I'm trying to prove that these two angles are congruent, I can prove first that these two triangles are, and then their corresponding angles would be. So triangle PQR would be congruent to triangle PSR. And that would be by side, side, side. Okay, you don't have any angles labeled. Then my last statement is what I'm trying to prove. So angle QRP is congruent to angle PRS. Since my triangles are congruent, their parts are as well. So we have corresponding parts, congruent triangles, congruent. Good. All right. On the back then, number 4, we have segment AE congruent to segment BE, and segment DE congruent to segment CE. So from my given, I need to prove angle D congruent to angle C. So first I can prove my two triangles congruent. I can't use any piece of this to go further with a statement, but I can look at my picture. In my picture, I do have a freebie of vertical angles. Okay, always look at that picture to see if you have a freebie. So since I labeled that, I need to write that out. So I have angle AED congruent to angle BEC. That is by the vertical angle theorem. Okay, next I can prove these triangles congruent. So triangle AED is congruent to triangle BEC. Why are those two triangles congruent? Side angle, side. Okay, now since these two triangles are congruent, these angles must be congruent within them. So angle D would be congruent to angle C by CPCTC. Okay, questions on 4? All right, 5 is a tiny bit different. So in number 5, we're given that segment WX, this segment here, is congruent to YZ. We're also given that ZW is congruent to XY. Okay? We want to prove that x or wx is parallel to zy. So we want to prove these two lines are parallel. So in order to do that, we will need to prove our triangle's congruent. That way we can find two congruent angles that would make those lines parallel. Okay? So here's my given. In order to prove these two triangles congruent, what do I notice first here? What? There is zx is equal to zx. Okay? Because I'm trying to first prove those triangles congruent. So this is by the reflexive property. Okay, what do you think's next? Sadie?
Triangle WZX is congruent to a triangle YXZ.
I forgot my triangle symbol.
Side, side, side.
And it would be by side, side, side. Good job. Okay, so now I have my two triangles congruent. Now think about this. I'm trying to prove that these two lines are parallel. Okay? So I'm trying to prove this line is parallel to this line. Now if I added zx as a transversal, okay? If I'm trying to prove lines parallel, I need angles to be congruent. Which two angles? Okay, there's a specific one, right? I'd have to say this angle right here is congruent to this angle right here.
Yes.
AIA convex.
So I can say angle YZX is congruent to angle WXZ. Why can I say those two angles are congruent? No.
Who said that?
Sadie?
Why does it have to be those two? Can it be the other Z and the other X or no?
No. Because you're using this line. We're trying to prove this line is parallel to this line. Not this line parallel to that line. Because your parallel line has to make an angle with your transversal.
Oh, okay, yeah, that's right.
Okay? So it would have to be these two. Make sense?
Yeah.
This is CPCTC because your corresponding angles have to be congruent before I can say lines are parallel. So my last one is WX parallel to ZY. And since I'm proving lines parallel, that's why I'm using a converse. Okay, so these were alternate interior angles. So by that converse, those lines would be parallel. Questions on the last one?